It was a sweltering afternoon in Manila, and the sun hung high in the sky, casting a bright, unrelenting heat over the crowded streets. Andrea wiped the sweat off her brow as she carried a basket of vegetables through the busy market. The loud honking of jeepneys and the constant chatter of vendors created a symphony of sounds, a cacophony of city life that was both chaotic and familiar to her. She moved through the hustle and bustle with practiced ease, accustomed to the rhythm of the city. Her family depended on her to buy groceries every week, and though it was exhausting, Andrea took pride in doing her part. Her life had always been simple, a life of early mornings, late nights, and a never-ending list of responsibilities. Andrea had dreams, sure, but they were tucked away in a quiet corner of her heart. Dreams were a luxury she didn't have time for. Every peso counted, and every day was spent working, whether it was helping her mother with laundry or looking after her younger siblings. Despite it all, she found moments of joy in the small things. The smell of freshly cooked rice, the sound of her siblings laughing, or a gentle breeze on a particularly hot day. As she walked past a row of fruit stalls, Andrea's eyes were momentarily drawn to a man standing near the entrance of the marketplace. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a confident stance, the kind of man who seemed out of place in such a modest setting. Dressed in a neatly pressed white shirt and jeans, he looked almost too clean for the grimy streets of the city. His eyes, framed by thick lashes, scanned the market as if searching for something or someone. Andrea shook her head, embarrassed by her own curiosity, and continued walking. She wasn't the type to be distracted by a man, much less someone who looked like he had never worked a day of manual labor in his life. But fate, as it often does, had different plans. As she rounded a corner, her basket suddenly tipped, spilling its contents onto the dirty pavement. Tomatoes rolled in every direction, and a handful of onions tumbled away, disappearing under a vendor's cart. Frustration surged within her as she knelt down to collect the scattered vegetables, her face flushed with embarrassment. She didn't notice the man from earlier approaching until she saw a hand reaching down to help her pick up the fallen produce. "Let me help you," he said, his voice soft yet assured. Andrea looked up, startled, and found herself staring into the same deep brown eyes she had seen just moments ago. He was even more striking up close, with a strong jawline and a slight smile playing on his lips. For a brief moment, Andrea forgot about the mess in front of her and simply blinked, unsure of how to respond. "It's okay," she mumbled, quickly averting her eyes. "I can manage." But Brian, she would later learn that was his name, ignored her protests and continued to help. Together, they gathered the remaining vegetables, and Andrea awkwardly stuffed them back in her basket, feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort. She wasn't used to strangers offering assistance, especially men who looked like they belonged in a boardroom rather than a dusty marketplace. Once they had collected everything, Brian stood up and handed her the last tomato. "There you go," he said, flashing her a smile that made her heart skip an unexpected beat. "You might want to be more careful next time." Andrea forced a smile, feeling self-conscious under his gaze. "Thanks," she muttered, clutching her basket tightly. She turned to leave, eager to escape the sudden rush of emotions she couldn't quite explain. But before she could take more than a few steps, Brian called out to her. "Wait!" She stopped, but didn't turn around. Her mind raced. What did he want now? She wasn't in the mood for idle chit-chat, especially not with someone like him. Still, something in his voice made her pause. Brian jogged up to her side, an easy smile still on his face. "I'm Brian, by the way," he said, offering his hand. Andrea hesitated before taking it, her own hand small and calloused compared to his. "Andrea," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nice to meet you, Andrea," Brian said warmly, releasing her hand. "I don't usually come to this part of town. Is it always this busy?" Andrea nodded, unsure of what to say. Why was he still talking to her? She had never been good at small talk, especially not with men like him. Men who exuded confidence and charm. But there was something about Brian that intrigued her, despite her better judgment. "Yeah, it's always like this," she replied, finally finding her voice. "Especially on weekends." Brian chuckled softly. "I figured. I'm not really used to crowds like this. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest." Andrea glanced at him, surprised by his admission. He didn't seem the type to be overwhelmed by anything. She found herself curious about him, despite her reluctance to engage in conversation. There was a vulnerability in his words that made him seem more approachable, more human. "Why are you here then?" she asked before she could stop herself. It was a bold question, but her curiosity got the better of her. Brian shrugged, his eyes drifting toward the market stalls. "Just wanted to explore, I guess. See a different side of the city." Andrea raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "And you thought the market was the best place to start?" He laughed, a sound that caught her off guard. It was a genuine laugh, free of pretension. Maybe not the best place, but definitely the most interesting. Despite herself, Andrea felt a smile tug at the corners of her lips. There was something refreshing about Brian, something disarming. He didn't seem to be trying to impress her, which was a welcome change from the usual men she encountered. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the market swirling around them, yet it felt as though they were in their own little bubble, separate from the chaos. Andrea, who had always prided herself on being practical and level-headed, couldn't help but feel a strange connection to this stranger. She didn't understand it, but it was there, a quiet pull that made her want to know more about him. "I should get going," Andrea said, breaking the silence. "I have to finish my shopping." "Of course," Brian said, though there was a hint of disappointment in his voice. "Maybe I'll see you around?" Andrea doubted it, but she nodded politely. "Maybe." With that, she turned and walked away, her heart beating just a little faster than before. As she navigated the crowded aisles, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. Brian was still standing there, watching her with a thoughtful expression on his face. She quickly looked away, feeling a strange flutter in her chest. By the time Andrea reached the end of the market, she had convinced herself that the encounter meant nothing. He was just a random guy, a nice guy sure, but nothing more. Her life was complicated enough without adding a handsome stranger into the mix. Yet, as she made her way home, she couldn't stop thinking about him. His smile, his laugh, the way his eyes seemed to see right through her defenses. It was ridiculous, really. She barely knew him. That night, as she lay in bed, Andrea found herself replaying their brief conversation over and over in her mind. It was strange how someone she had just met could make such an impression on her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that it was just a fleeting moment, nothing more. But deep down, a small part of her wondered if fate had something else in store. Brian, meanwhile, found himself equally captivated. As he drove back to his side of the city, he couldn't get Andrea out of his mind. There was something about her, something genuine and unassuming that had drawn him in. She was different from the women he usually met, women who were all too eager to impress or be impressed. Andrea didn't seem to care about any of that. She was real, and that was what intrigued him the most. He didn't know when or how, but Brian knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't be the last time he saw Andrea. It had been several days since Andrea's unexpected encounter with Brian at the market, yet she couldn't shake the memory of him from her mind. Each time she passed the same spot where they had met, she found herself glancing around, half expecting to see him standing there with that same easy smile and warm eyes. But he wasn't there. Life had continued as usual, filled with her everyday routines of helping her family, working odd jobs, and keeping her dreams hidden beneath the surface of her responsibilities. Brian, however, was not the kind of man to let such an encounter pass by without following up. There was something about Andrea that had intrigued him from the start. She was so unlike anyone he had ever met, unassuming, genuine, and clearly carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders with grace. She wasn't impressed by his status or his material wealth, and that alone made her stand out in a way that no other woman had. He found himself thinking about her more than he expected, and after a few restless nights, Brian decided he had to see her again one afternoon. As Andrea was returning from her usual market trip, she was startled to find Brian waiting at the same spot they had first met. He was leaning casually against a nearby fruit stall, looking as though he had been there for a while. Her heart leapt at the sight of him, though she quickly tried to suppress the sudden rush of excitement that filled her chest. She reminded herself that she barely knew this man, and allowing herself to be swept away by the memory of their brief encounter would only lead to disappointment. Life had taught her to be cautious, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But Brian wasn't about to let her slip away so easily. He smiled as soon as he saw her, and it was the kind of smile that could melt away even the most well-guarded walls. "Hey, Andrea," he called out, pushing himself off the stall and walking toward her. He had the same relaxed, confident air about him as before, and his presence seemed to command attention, even in the crowded market. "Fancy meeting you here again." Andrea raised an eyebrow, trying to play it cool despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I come here every week," she replied, clutching her basket a little tighter. "It's not exactly a coincidence." Brian chuckled, sensing her guardedness, but undeterred by it. "I guess you're right, but maybe I was hoping it wasn't just a coincidence." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I've been thinking about you, Andrea." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. There was something about the way he said her name, like he had thought about it, tasted the syllables on his tongue before letting them roll out. It made her feel seen in a way that both frightened and intrigued her. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Why would someone like you be thinking about someone like me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and immediately she regretted it. It sounded defensive, as though she were challenging him. Brian didn't miss a beat, though. His expression softened even further, and he stepped closer, though he still gave her enough space to retreat if she wanted to. "Why wouldn't I be? You're different, Andrea. You're real. You're not like anyone else I know." He rubbed the back of his neck, as if searching for the right words. "I don't know how to explain it, but I do know I'd like to get to know you better." Andrea blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. It was rare for someone to be so direct, and even rarer for a man of his stature to show interest in someone like her. Her mind raced, weighing the risks of letting him into her life. Her heart, however, betrayed her practical nature, beating faster with each word he spoke. She found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "Okay," she said softly, surprising even herself. "Maybe we could talk sometime." Brian's face lit up, and he grinned, looking more like an excited boy than the confident man he appeared to be. "How about now? Are you free? I know a great spot where we could grab something to eat and just talk." Andrea hesitated again. She hadn't planned for this. She had responsibilities waiting for her at home, and the last thing she wanted was for her mother to start worrying about her whereabouts. But something in Brian's eyes told her that this was an opportunity she might regret passing up. "I have to be back soon," she said cautiously. "But maybe for a little while?" "Perfect," Brian said, his excitement barely contained. "I promise I won't keep you long." The two of them walked together through the busy streets, making their way to a small, quiet cafe tucked away in one of the quieter parts of town. It was a cozy little place with mismatched furniture and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. As they sat down at a small table near the window, Andrea felt the initial awkwardness melt away. Something about the intimate atmosphere of the cafe, coupled with Brian's relaxed demeanor, made it easy to talk. They started with the usual small talk, where they grew up, their favorite foods, their hobbies. But as the conversation flowed, it quickly became clear that there was a deeper connection between them. Brian spoke about his family, his work, and the pressures of living up to certain expectations, something Andrea hadn't expected from someone who seemed so self-assured. He confessed that despite his privileged background, he often felt like he was missing something important in his life, something real. Andrea, in turn, found herself opening up about her own struggles, more than she ever thought she would with someone she had just met. She told him about her family, the weight of being the eldest daughter, and the constant financial pressures that dictated her every decision. She spoke about her dreams, the ones she rarely allowed herself to think about, and the fear that they would always remain out of reach. Today, as she spoke, Brian listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. He asked thoughtful questions, not out of politeness, but because he genuinely wanted to know her. Andrea couldn't remember the last time someone had listened to her like this, as if every word she said mattered. Time seemed to slip away as they talked, the world outside the cafe fading into the background. Andrea found herself laughing at Brian's jokes, surprised by how easily he could make her smile. His charm, which she had initially found intimidating, now felt disarming and warm. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the window, Andrea realized just how comfortable she felt in his presence. But even as her heart began to open to him, there was a small voice in the back of her mind warning her to be careful. She had learned the hard way that life didn't always go as planned, and trusting someone, especially someone like Brian, could lead to heartbreak. Could she really let herself fall for him? What would her family think? What would people say about a man like Brian and a woman like her? As if sensing her internal struggle, Brian reached across the table and gently took her hand in his. His touch was warm, and the gesture was simple, yet it sent a shiver down Andrea's spine. "You don't have to be afraid, Andrea," he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to get to know you. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together." Andrea looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was honesty and a desire to understand her. Her heart, which had been so carefully guarded for so long, began to soften. Maybe, just maybe, Brian was someone she could trust. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the meaning behind it was clear. She was willing to take the risk. Over the next few weeks, Andrea and Brian saw each other whenever they could. Brian would meet her at the market after she finished her shopping, and they would go for long walks or sit in the same little cafe, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Each time they were together, Andrea felt the walls around her heart crumble a little more. Brian, for his part, was falling harder and faster than he had anticipated. Andrea wasn't like any woman he had ever known. She was kind, thoughtful, and strong in a way that both humbled and inspired him. He found himself looking forward to their conversations, craving her presence in a way that surprised him. He had dated plenty of women before, but none of them had ever made him feel like this, like he had finally found something real. The more time they spent together, the more their feelings for each other grew. Brian would often find himself staring at Andrea when she wasn't looking, marveling at how effortlessly beautiful she was. It wasn't just her physical beauty, though that certainly took his breath away. It was the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she carried herself with dignity even when life was hard. Andrea, too, began to see Brian in a new light. Beneath his charm and good looks, she found a man who was thoughtful. Weeks had passed since Andrea and Brian's relationship began to take shape, and life had settled into an unexpected rhythm. Andrea, once so hesitant to open her heart, now found herself yearning for the moments she and Brian spent together. His presence had become a constant in her life, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to dream of a future that wasn't dictated by hardship or sacrifice. But while their connection deepened, the reality of their vastly different worlds began to loom over them, threatening to tear apart what they were carefully building together. Andrea's life had always been one of quiet struggle. She was no stranger to making do with less, to sacrificing her own dreams for the sake of her family's survival. Every peso she earned from her work went towards helping her parents and her younger siblings. She had grown used to the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, the constant worry about whether they would have enough food on the table or if the roof over their heads would hold through another rainy season. Her life was dictated by the ebb and flow of survival, and in that world, there was little room for luxuries like love or indulgence. Brian, on the other hand, had been born into a world where struggle was a foreign concept. His family was well off, his upbringing one of privilege and comfort. He had never had to wonder where his next meal would come from or whether his family could afford to send him to school. His problems, while real to him, seemed trivial compared to the challenges Andrea faced daily. Despite his good intentions, he was oblivious to the full extent of the sacrifices Andrea made for her family and the life she led it first. Their differences seemed insignificant. In the bubble they created when they were together, nothing else mattered. They laughed, shared stories, and dreamed of what could be. But slowly, the cracks in their seemingly perfect connection began to show. Andrea's responsibilities weighed heavily on her, and no matter how hard she tried to compartmentalize, the reality of her life started to creep into the moments she shared with Brian. One evening, Brian had planned a surprise for Andrea. He had arranged a romantic dinner at an upscale restaurant in the city, complete with candlelight, a private table, and a stunning view of the skyline. It was the kind of place Andrea had only ever seen in movies, far removed from the simple eatery she was used to. Brian had been excited about the evening for days, convinced that it would be a night to remember. He had even bought Andrea a new dress, something elegant and beautiful that he knew would make her stand out. But when Andrea arrived at the restaurant, she felt a growing sense of unease. The opulence of the place, the glimmering chandeliers, the well-dressed patrons, it all felt alien to her. She had never been in a setting like this before, and she couldn't help but feel out of place. She had grown up in a world where every cent mattered, where her clothes were hand-me-downs or bought secondhand, and where a night out was a rare treat, not an expectation. Here, in this luxurious restaurant, she felt like an outsider. Brian, ever the gentleman, greeted her with a wide smile and kissed her on the cheek as he pulled out her chair. "You look amazing," he said, his eyes lighting up as he admired the way the dress hugged her figure. Andrea smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice betraying the discomfort she was trying so hard to hide. As the evening progressed, Andrea found it increasingly difficult to enjoy herself. The food, while delicious, was foreign to her, tiny, elaborate dishes that felt more like art than nourishment. The other diners were dressed in expensive clothing, their conversations filled with talk of business deals, vacations, and investments. She felt a growing sense of inadequacy, as though she didn't belong in this world that Brian seemed so comfortable in. Brian, sensing her unease but not fully understanding it, reached across the table and took her hand. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. Andrea hesitated, not wanting to ruin the evening he had so carefully planned. She could see how much effort he had put into making this night special for her, and the last thing she wanted was to seem ungrateful. But the truth was, she felt like she was suffocating in this world of luxury and privilege. It was a world that felt completely at odds with her own, and no matter how much she cared for Brian, she couldn't ignore the widening gap between them. "I'm fine," she said after a moment, forcing a smile. "This place is beautiful, Brian. Really, it's lovely." But Brian wasn't convinced. He knew her well enough by now to know when something was bothering her. "You don't have to pretend with me, Andrea. If something's wrong, you can tell me." Andrea looked down at her hands, her fingers playing with the edge of the tablecloth. She didn't know how to explain what she was feeling without sounding ungrateful or petty, but she couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. "It's just this place," she said quietly. "It's so different from what I'm used to. I feel like I don't belong here." Brian's expression softened, and he gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You belong anywhere I'm with you, Andrea. You don't have to worry about fitting in. I don't care about any of this, about the fancy restaurants or the clothes. I just wanted to do something nice for you." Andrea sighed, appreciating his sentiment, but knowing that it wasn't that simple. "I know you meant well, Brian, and I'm grateful, really, but it's hard for me to relax in a place like this. I've never been in a restaurant this fancy before. I feel out of place." Brian frowned, clearly at a loss. "I didn't realize I just wanted to treat you to something special." "I know," Andrea said, her voice gentle, "but I don't need all of this. I don't need expensive dinners or fancy dresses. I just want to be with you, Brian. That's enough for me." Brian nodded, though he still looked troubled. "I just want to give you the things you deserve, Andrea. You work so hard, and I want to take care of you." Andrea smiled sadly. "I appreciate that, but I don't need to be taken care of. I've been taking care of myself and my family for a long time. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me. I just want someone who understands me." There was a long pause as Brian processed her words. He had never thought of it that way before. In his mind, showering her with gifts and taking her to nice places was his way of showing how much he cared for her. But he was beginning to realize that Andrea didn't want or need those things. What she needed was someone who understood the weight she carried every day and who could walk beside her in her world, not just try to bring her into his. "I'm sorry," Brian said quietly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. Sometimes I forget that we come from different worlds." Andrea looked up at him, her eyes softening. It's not your fault, Brian. I know you're trying to do something nice. It's hard for me sometimes to bridge that gap between our lives. Brian reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I don't care about where we come from, Andrea. I care about where we're going, and I want to go there with you. Andrea's heart swelled at his words, but the nagging doubts in the back of her mind wouldn't let go. Could they really make it work? Could they build a life together when their worlds were so different? They finished the rest of their dinner in comfortable silence, but Andrea's mind was still racing. She couldn't deny the depth of her feelings for Brian, but she also couldn't ignore the growing tension between their realities. As much as she cared for him, she knew that love wasn't always enough to bridge the gap between two very different lives. A few days later, Andrea found herself at home, sitting on the porch as the late afternoon sun bathed the small yard in a warm glow. She was lost in thought, her mind still tangled in the complexities of her relationship with Brian. Her mother, ever perceptive, came out and sat beside her. "You've been quiet lately," her mother said, her voice gentle but probing. "Is everything okay?" Andrea hesitated before responding, unsure of how much she should reveal. Her mother had always been her rock, the one person who knew her better than anyone else. But Andrea wasn't sure how her mother would react to the growing relationship between her and Brian, especially considering their vastly different backgrounds. "I'm just thinking about some things," Andrea said after a moment. Her mother raised an eyebrow. "Things or someone?" Andrea smiled despite herself. Her mother had always been quick to catch on. "Someone," she admitted softly. Her mother nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "Is it Brian?" Andrea glanced at her in surprise. "How did you know?" "A mother knows these things," her mother replied with a knowing smile. "You've been seeing him for a while now, haven't you?" Andrea nodded. "Yeah, he's wonderful, Mom. He's kind, caring, and he makes me feel special." Her mother smiled, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "But," Andrea sighed, feeling the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. "But we're so different, Mom. He comes from a completely different world than we do. His family has money, and they live in a way I can't even imagine. I'm not sure if I belong in his world." Her mother reached out and placed a comforting hand on Andrea's arm. "Love isn't about where you come from, Andrea. It's about where you're going together. If Brian cares for you, and if you care for him, that's all that matters." Andrea looked down, still uncertain. "I just don't know if it's enough, Mom. Our lives are so different. I don't want to lose myself trying to fit into his world." Her mother's grip on her arm tightened slightly, as if to reassure her. "You don't have to change who you are, Andrea. If Brian truly loves you, he'll accept you for who you are and where you come from, and you'll do the same for him." Andrea nodded, though her mind was still filled with doubts. She wanted to believe that their love could overcome the challenges they faced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their differences were too great to ignore. Brian's growing frustration with Andrea's reluctance to fully embrace his world came to a head one evening when they were sitting on the couch in his apartment. He had been talking excitedly about an upcoming family trip to Europe and how he wanted Andrea to come with him. But as he spoke, Andrea's expression grew more and more distant. "I don't think I can go, Brian," Andrea said quietly when he finally paused for breath. Brian looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Of course you can go. I'll cover all the expenses. It'll be an amazing trip." Andrea shook her head. "It's not about the money, Brian. I can't just leave my family for weeks at a time. They depend on me. My siblings need me to help take care of them, and I can't just drop everything and go on a vacation." Brian frowned, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Andrea, you deserve to have some time for yourself. You work so hard, and I want you to have the chance to enjoy life. Why can't you let me take care of you for once?" Andrea sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Brian, but you don't understand. My family is my responsibility. I can't just walk away from that." Brian's frustration boiled over, and he stood up, running a hand through his hair. "Why do you always have to put everyone else first? Why can't you let yourself have something good for a change?" Andrea looked up at him, her heart aching at the tension between them. "Because this is my life, Brian. I can't change who I am or the responsibilities I have. You may not understand it, but this is the reality I live in every day." Brian's shoulders slumped and he sat back down, rubbing his hands over his face. "I just don't want to lose you, Andrea. I feel like there's this wall between us, and I don't know how to break through it." Andrea's heart broke at the vulnerability in his voice, and she reached out to take his hand. "I don't want to lose you either, Brian, but we need to figure out how to make this work without losing ourselves in the process." As they sat there in silence, both of them realized that their love for each other was strong, but so were the challenges they faced. Whether they could overcome them remained to be seen. But for now, all they could do was hold on to each other and hope that love would be enough. Andrea stood in front of her small mirror, smoothing out the wrinkles in her uniform. The pale light from the bare bulb overhead flickered slightly, casting faint shadows across her face. The familiar creaks of the old wooden floor under her feet reminded her of where she was, a home that had sheltered her through many hardships, but one that she increasingly feared might not be enough for the future she desired. She stared at her reflection, trying to suppress the growing unease in her heart. Life with Brian was becoming more complicated by the day, and no matter how much she tried to push it aside, she couldn't ignore the widening gulf between their worlds. Over the past few weeks, the excitement that had filled the early days of their relationship had dimmed, replaced by a growing tension that neither of them seemed able to fully address. The initial thrill of being with someone so different, someone who made her feel alive and cherished, was now overshadowed by the constant reminder of just how different their lives really were. Every date, every conversation seemed to highlight the vast gap between their realities. His world of privilege and ease, and her world of responsibility and sacrifice. That it wasn't that Andrea didn't love Brian. She did, more deeply than she had ever expected to love anyone. He was kind, attentive, and so full of dreams for their future. But those dreams were starting to feel like fragile things, beautiful, but impossible to sustain in the harsh light of her everyday life. She couldn't escape the feeling that they were standing on opposite sides of an invisible line, and no matter how much they reached for each other, they would never quite bridge the gap. Brian, too, was feeling the strain. He sat in his car outside Andrea's house, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to gather his thoughts. He had always known that Andrea's life was different from his own, but lately, those differences felt insurmountable. He loved her. There was no question about that. But he didn't know how to reconcile his desire to take care of her with her fiercely independent spirit. She never asked for anything, never complained, but he could see the weight of her responsibilities wearing her down. And it frustrated him that no matter what he did, it never seemed to be enough. Brian had been raised to believe that problems could be solved with the right amount of money, effort, or influence. His family's wealth had always been a buffer, insulating him from the harsh realities that others faced. But with Andrea, it was different. No amount of money or good intentions could change the fact that she had a family who depended on her, or that her life was built around sacrifices he could barely comprehend. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down before he stepped out of the car and walked to the front door of her modest home. As he knocked, the familiar sound of bustling activity inside greeted him. Andrea's younger siblings laughing, her mother humming as she prepared dinner. It was a far cry from the quiet, orderly home Brian had grown up in, but it was warm, full of life and love. Andrea opened the door, smiling up at him, though there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Hey," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Brian leaned down to kiss her cheek before stepping inside, his eyes sweeping over the cozy, cluttered living room. "Hey, how's everything going?" Andrea shrugged, moving back toward the kitchen where her mother was stirring a pot of stew on the stove. "Same as always. Busy, but we're managing." Brian watched her as she worked, her movements efficient but tired. He wanted to take her in his arms and tell her that she didn't have to manage everything alone, that she didn't have to be the one holding everything together. But he knew that wasn't what she wanted to hear. Andrea prided herself on her independence, and the last thing she would accept was pity. Still, he couldn't help the wave of frustration that rose inside him. He hated seeing her so worn down, so consumed by the demands of her life. "You don't have to do it all, you know," he said, his voice gentler than he intended. Andrea glanced up from where she was chopping vegetables, her brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? Brian hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I mean, you don't have to carry everything by yourself. You have me now. I want to help. Andrea's hands stilled on the cutting board, and she looked at him, her eyes soft but firm. I appreciate that, Brian. I really do. But this is my family. They've always depended on me, and that's not going to change. I'm not asking you to abandon them, Brian said quickly, stepping closer to her. I just don't want you to burn yourself out trying to be everything for everyone. You deserve to have time for yourself too, Andrea. To rest, to enjoy life. Andrea smiled sadly, her heart aching at his words. She knew he meant well, but he didn't understand. That's not how it works for me, she said quietly. I don't have the luxury of taking time for myself. My family needs me. Brian's frustration bubbled to the surface, and he ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small kitchen. But you have me now. Why can't you let me help? I could take care of things, Andrea. I can make things easier for you. Andrea's heart sank as she watched him struggle to understand. She wished more than anything that things could be that simple, that she could just let go of the responsibilities that had defined her life for so long. But she knew that wasn't possible. Brian, it's not that easy. I can't just hand over my responsibilities to you. This is my life. My family is my life. Brian stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and hurt. But what about us, Andrea? What about our life together? How can we move forward if you're always tied down by these responsibilities? Andrea's throat tightened as she tried to hold back tears. She had asked herself that same question 100 times in the quiet moments when she was alone. How could they build a future together when her present was so consumed by the needs of her family? I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and doubts. Brian stepped forward, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. I love you, Andrea. I want a future with you, but we can't keep living in two different worlds. Andrea closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. She loved him too, more than she had ever expected to love anyone. But his world, with its comforts and luxuries, felt so far removed from the life she knew. And no matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't see how they would ever bridge the gap. The next day, Brian's frustrations only grew. He had dinner with his parents, who, although supportive of his relationship with Andrea, had made it clear that they had their concerns. They had raised subtle but pointed questions about whether Andrea's background would make it difficult for her to fit into their social circles, or whether Brian would be able to maintain the lifestyle he was accustomed to while also accommodating her family's needs. Brian's father, always the pragmatic one, had asked the hardest question of all. Do you see a future with her, Brian? A real future? One where you're not constantly struggling to make things work. Brian had bristled at the question, but deep down, it echoed his own fears. Could he and Andrea really make it work? Could they build a life together when their lives were so different? He wanted to believe that love was enough, but lately, it felt like they were always fighting an uphill battle. That evening, after the uncomfortable dinner with his parents, Brian drove to Andrea's house again. He needed to talk to her to try and figure out how they could move forward. But as he pulled up in front of her house, he saw something that made his heart sink. Andrea was sitting on the porch with her younger siblings, laughing as they played a simple game with a ball. Her mother stood nearby, watching with a smile as Andrea helped her little brother toss the ball into a makeshift goal they had set up with old chairs. The scene was so ordinary, so filled with love and simplicity, that it made Brian feel like an intruder. This was Andrea's world, a world where family came first, where everything was shared, and where every small moment was cherished. It was a world that Brian admired, but one he wasn't sure he could ever fully understand. He sat in his car, watching from a distance, feeling the weight of the decision he knew was coming. He loved Andrea, but he couldn't shake the growing realization that their lives might be too different to ever truly come together. He didn't want to lose her, but he also didn't know how to be a part of her world without losing himself. After a few minutes, Brian sighed and started the car, driving away without ever getting out. He needed time to think, to figure out what he wanted, and what he was willing to sacrifice for the woman he loved. Meanwhile, Andrea was feeling the strain of their differences just as acutely. She couldn't deny the love she had for Brian, but every time she thought about their future, she felt the weight of her responsibilities pulling her in another direction. She couldn't abandon her family, but she also didn't want to lose Brian. It felt like an impossible choice, and no matter how hard she tried to make it work, the tension between them kept growing. As the days passed, both Andrea and Brian were left grappling with the same question. Could love really conquer all? Or were the differences between their worlds too great to overcome? Brian sat in his car, staring at the text on his phone from Andrea, his heart heavy with uncertainty. She had asked to meet him at their favorite cafe, the one they had discovered together early in their relationship. It was a small, unassuming place, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, far removed from the bustling social circles his family moved in. The cafe had become their sanctuary, a place where they could escape the pressures of their respective lives and just be together. But lately, even that small refuge had felt fragile. Brian glanced at his watch and realized he had been sitting in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, lost in thought. He wanted to see Andrea, to talk things through, but there was a knot in his stomach that refused to go away. Their last few conversations had been strained, filled with unspoken fears and frustrations. He wasn't sure if he was ready for another round of that, but he also knew they couldn't keep avoiding the issues that had been slowly pulling them apart. With a sigh, Brian stepped out of the car and made his way into the cafe. As he walked through the door, the familiar smell of coffee and freshly baked pastries greeted him, but it did little to ease the tension in his chest. He spotted Andrea sitting at a table by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked up when she saw him, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey," Brian said as he slid into the seat across from her. "Hey," Andrea replied softly, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her cup. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their unresolved issues hanging between them. The cafe, usually a place of warmth and comfort, felt different today. Quieter, more distant, as if even the familiar surroundings couldn't ease the growing divide between them. "I'm glad you came," Andrea said, finally breaking the silence. "Of course," Brian replied, his voice gentle but cautious. "We need to talk." Andrea nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yeah, we do." Brian leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Andrea, I know things have been hard lately. I know I haven't been able to understand everything the way I should. But I want to make this work." Andrea looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. "I want that too, Brian. But I don't know if we can keep pretending that love is enough to fix everything. Our lives are just so different." Brian felt a pang of frustration, though he tried to keep his voice calm. "I know we come from different worlds, but that doesn't mean we can't build something together. I love you, Andrea. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." Andrea smiled faintly, her heart aching at his words. She believed him. She knew Brian loved her, and she loved him too. But love wasn't the issue. It was the growing realization that love alone might not be enough to bridge the gap between them. "I know you're willing to try, Brian, but it's more complicated than that. It's not just about love. It's about the expectations that come with being a part of each other's lives." Brian frowned, not fully understanding. "What do you mean?" Andrea hesitated, trying to find the right words to explain the growing weight she had been feeling. "You come from a world where things are easier. You have money, security, opportunities that I've never even dreamed of. And it's not just about the material things. It's about the way your family sees me. They've been kind, but I know they don't think I belong. They look at me and see someone who will never fit into their world." Brian's heart sank at her words. He had known that his parents had concerns about their relationship, but he hadn't realized how deeply it was affecting Andrea. "My parents don't matter, Andrea. What matters is us. I don't care what they think." Andrea shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "But I care, Brian. I care because I see the way they look at me, the way they talk about our future. They see me as a burden, someone who will hold you back. And I don't want to be that." Brian reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You're not a burden, Andrea. You never have been. I love you, and I want to build a life with you." My parents will come around eventually. They just need time to see how much you mean to me." Andrea squeezed his hand, her heart torn between her love for Brian and the growing doubts that had been gnawing at her for weeks. "I don't want to come between you and your family, Brian. And it's not just them, it's my family too. I can't just walk away from them. They need me, and I don't know if I can be the person you need while also being the person they need." Brian felt a lump form in his throat. He had known from the beginning that Andrea's family was important to her, but he hadn't fully grasped just how much of herself she had given to them. He had always admired her selflessness, her dedication to her siblings and her mother, but now he was starting to realize that her sense of duty might be the very thing that kept them apart. "You don't have to choose, Andrea," Brian said softly. "You don't have to be one or the other. We can figure this out together. I'll help you with your family. I'll do whatever it takes to make things work." Andrea's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at their joined hands. "I wish it were that simple. But the truth is, I don't know if I can be in both worlds at the same time. I don't want to lose myself trying to fit into your world, but I also don't want to lose you." Brian's heart ached at her words. He had never felt so helpless, so unsure of how to make things right. He loved Andrea with everything he had, but for the first time, he was starting to wonder if love was enough to overcome the growing distance between them. Over the next few days, Brian and Andrea continued to wrestle with the uncertainty that had settled over their relationship. They spent time together, but there was a new tension between them, an unspoken fear that neither of them could shake. The more they tried to hold on to each other, the more it seemed like the ground beneath their feet was shifting, pulling them in opposite directions. One evening, Brian invited Andrea to a charity gala his parents were hosting. It was the kind of event that Brian had grown up attending, lavish, glamorous, filled with the city's elite. He knew it wasn't Andrea's scene, but he hoped that by including her in this part of his life, they could start to bridge the gap between their worlds. Andrea agreed to go, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She knew how important the event was to Brian, and she didn't want to let him down. But the thought of spending an evening surrounded by people who would see her as an outsider, who would judge her for not fitting into their world, filled her with dread. As they walked into the grand ballroom, Andrea felt her heart race. The room was filled with elegantly dressed guests, the sound of soft classical music playing in the background. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a golden glow over the room, and waiters in crisp black uniforms moved gracefully between the tables, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Brian smiled down at her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. "You look beautiful," he whispered, his eyes filled with pride. Andrea forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent hours getting ready, choosing the most elegant dress she could afford and borrowing a pair of heels from a friend. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. As the evening went on, Andrea felt more and more out of place. The conversations around her were filled with talk of business deals, luxury vacations, and high society events. She struggled to keep up, her mind drifting back to her family and the simple life they led. She couldn't help but feel like an imposter, pretending to be someone she wasn't in order to fit into Brian's world. At one point, Brian's mother approached them, her eyes flicking over Andrea's dress with a polite but distant smile. "You look lovely, dear," she said, though her tone lacked warmth. "I hope you're enjoying the evening." Andrea smiled tightly, nodding. "Thank you. It's a beautiful event." Brian's mother nodded, her gaze lingering on Andrea for a moment before turning to Brian. "Darling, your father wanted to introduce you to someone from the board. Why don't you come with me for a moment?" Brian glanced at Andrea, his brow furrowing slightly. "I'll be right back, okay?" Andrea nodded, trying to hide the sinking feeling in her chest. "Sure, take your time." As Brian walked away with his mother, Andrea felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. She stood there, feeling out of place and disconnected from the world around her. She could see the other guests glancing her way, their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. They knew she didn't belong, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were right. Later that night, after the gala had ended, Brian and Andrea sat in his car, the tension between them palpable. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the silence stretching out between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Finally, Andrea spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Brian, I can't keep doing this." Brian turned to her, his heart sinking. "What do you mean?" Tears welled up in Andrea's eyes, and she looked down at her hands. "I love you, but I don't know if I can keep trying to fit into your world. It's not who I am, and I don't want to lose myself trying to be someone I'm not." Brian's heart ached at her words, and he reached for her hand, but Andrea pulled away, her tears spilling over. Andrea stood in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection as tears welled in her eyes. The woman looking back at her was unrecognizable, her makeup carefully applied, her hair styled to perfection, her dress a luxurious gown Brian had bought for her as a gift. But all these beautiful details felt hollow, like she was playing a part in someone else's life. It wasn't who she truly was, and the reality of it was tearing her apart. She had tried so hard to fit into Brian's world, to mold herself into the perfect woman for him, but it was becoming painfully clear that she was losing herself in the process. The memory of the gala from the previous night still stung. Surrounded by people who saw her as an outsider, she had never felt more alone in her life. Brian had been at her side, his hand resting gently on the small of her back, but even his presence couldn't shield her from the looks, the whispers, the judgmental eyes of his family and their wealthy friends. She felt like an imposter, like a stranger in the very life she was supposed to build with him. And now, more than ever, she was questioning whether love alone was enough to sustain them. Andrea wiped her tears and took a deep breath. She needed to talk to Brian. They couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when the cracks in their relationship were growing deeper by the day. She loved him, God, how she loved him, but it was time to face the truth. They were two people from two vastly different worlds, and those differences were beginning to tear them apart. The sound of the front door opening pulled Andrea from her thoughts. She hurried to the living room, her heart pounding in her chest as she saw Brian step inside, carrying a bouquet of her favorite flowers, white lilies. He smiled when he saw her, that same warm, loving smile that had made her fall for him in the first place. But tonight, it didn't bring her comfort. It only made the lump in her throat grow larger. "Hey, beautiful," Brian said softly, crossing the room to place the bouquet on the table. He leaned down to kiss her cheek, but Andrea pulled away, her eyes brimming with tears once again. Brian frowned, concern etched across his face. "Andrea, what's wrong?" Andrea turned away, her arms wrapping around herself, as if to protect her heart from breaking. "We need to talk, Brian," she whispered. Brian's heart sank. He had been sensing the growing tension between them, but he had hoped that a romantic gesture would help smooth things over. He had been so focused on trying to make her feel at home in his world that he hadn't stopped to consider how much it was hurting her. "Andrea, please, talk to me. What's going on?" Andrea closed her eyes, gathering the strength to say the words that had been weighing on her heart for days. "I can't do this anymore." Brian froze, his stomach dropping at her words. "Well, what do you mean?" Tears streamed down Andrea's cheeks as she turned to face him, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "I've tried so hard to be the woman you need, to fit into your world. But every day, I feel like I'm losing a little bit more of myself. And I don't know if I can keep doing this." Brian's mind raced, panic setting in as he realized just how serious she was. He had known things were tough, but he hadn't understood just how deeply she was hurting. "Andrea, please don't say that. We can work this out. I love you. We'll figure this out together." Andrea shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "It's not that simple, Brian. I love you too, but love isn't enough to fix this. We come from two different worlds, and no matter how much we love each other, we can't change that. Your family will never accept me, and I'll never be able to fully fit into the life you want." Brian took a step forward, his heart breaking at the sight of her tears. "I don't care about my family, Andrea. I care about you. You're the one I want to spend my life with." "But I care, Brian," Andrea said, her voice rising with the pain she had been holding in for so long. "I care because every time I'm around them, I feel like I'm not good enough. I see the way they look at me, the way they talk about our future, and it hurts. It hurts because I know I'll never be the woman they want you to be with. Brian shook his head, his voice desperate. You don't have to be the woman they want, Andrea. You're the woman I want. You're everything to me. Andrea's heart ached at his words. She knew he meant them, but she also knew that love alone couldn't erase the reality of their situation. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life fighting to be accepted, Brian. I don't want to lose myself trying to fit into a world that doesn't want me. Brian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He hated feeling so powerless, so helpless to fix the one thing that mattered most to him. So, what are you saying? Are you breaking up with me? Andrea sobbed, her heart shattering at the very thought. I don't want to, Brian, but I don't know how to make this work. Brian's chest tightened, his eyes burning with unshed tears. I'll do whatever it takes, Andrea. I'll talk to my family. I'll tell them that they have to accept you, or they'll lose me too. We'll make this work, I swear. Andrea wiped at her tears, her voice trembling. I don't want you to have to choose between me and your family. I would never ask you to do that. But I also can't keep living with this weight on my heart, knowing that I'll never fully belong in your life. Brian felt like his world was crumbling around him. He had thought their love was strong enough to overcome anything, but now he was realizing just how fragile it was. So what do we do, Andrea? What do we do? Andrea shook her head, her voice breaking. I don't know, Brian. I don't know. The days that followed were filled with unbearable silence and distance. Brian and Andrea had always been inseparable, spending every spare moment together. But now it was as if a wall had been built between them. Brian tried to call her, text her, even show up at her apartment, but Andrea always had an excuse. She needed space, she said. Time to think. Brian hated it. He hated being apart from her, hated not knowing what was going on in her mind. He had spent so much of their relationship trying to protect her, trying to shield her from the harsh realities of his family's expectations and the judgment of their social circles. But now it felt like everything he had done was for nothing. Andrea was slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to stop it. One evening, after days of agonizing silence, Brian found himself standing outside Andrea's apartment again. He had brought her flowers, just like he always did, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could talk things through. But as he knocked on the door, his heart heavy with fear, he knew deep down that things had changed. And no matter how much he wanted to believe otherwise, he couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the end. Andrea opened the door slowly, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him with a look of deep sorrow. Brian held out the flowers, his voice soft. I brought these for you. Andrea looked at the bouquet, her heart breaking. Please, Andrea, Brian said, his voice filled with desperation. Just talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking. Andrea stepped aside, letting him in, but the atmosphere in the apartment was thick with tension. She sat down on the couch, wringing her hands together as if she didn't know where to begin. Brian sat beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. Andrea, I love you. I love you more than anything in this world, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. But I need you to tell me what you're feeling. I need to know if you still want to be with me. Andrea's lips trembled, her eyes filling with tears once again. I love you too, Brian. I do. But I'm scared. I'm scared that we're fighting a battle we can't win. Your family will always see me as an outsider, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep fighting for something that might never change. Brian's heart shattered at her words. He had always believed that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, but now he was starting to question that belief. So, what do you want to do? He asked quietly. Andrea looked down at her hands, tears falling onto her lap. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Brian felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He had never been so scared of losing someone in his life. Please, Andrea, don't give up on us. Don't give up on what we have. Andrea sobbed, her heart breaking in two. I don't want to, Brian, but I don't know if love is enough anymore. Brian reached out to her. The sun rose slowly over the city, casting a golden hue over the buildings and streets. The vibrant colors illuminated Andrea's apartment, yet the light felt cold and distant. She sat in the kitchen, staring at her untouched cup of coffee, the steam rising like her unresolved emotions. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the heartache that had become an unwelcome companion in her life. Today marked a pivotal moment in her relationship with Brian, and she knew that the choices she made would echo in both their lives forever. The memories of their love rushed back to her, a kaleidoscope of laughter, tenderness, and moments of passion. She could still recall their first meeting, how Brian had approached her with a smile that made her heart flutter, how they had talked for hours under the stars, oblivious to the world around them. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago, buried beneath the weight of expectations and fears that had crept in like a thief in the night. Now, faced with the reality of their situation, Andrea felt lost, in a desperate attempt to find clarity. Andrea grabbed her phone and opened the messaging app. She hesitated, her finger hovering over Brian's name. What could she say? She felt torn between her love for him and the fear of being inadequate in his world. Just as she was about to put the phone down, a notification popped up, a text from Brian. "Can we talk? Please." Her heart raced at the sight of his message. A part of her wanted to run to him, to collapse into his arms and forget about everything else. But the other part, the part that had been so deeply wounded by the circumstances surrounding them, hesitated. She took a deep breath and typed a response. "Okay, I'll meet you at the park." The park was bustling with life as children laughed and played, couples strolled hand in hand, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. It was a beautiful day, but to Andrea, it felt like a stage set for a play with an uncertain ending. She arrived at their usual spot, a secluded bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, and her heart sank when she saw Brian already waiting there, looking anxious and hopeful. "Hey," he said softly, standing up as she approached. He looked like a man who had been fighting battles within himself, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," Andrea replied, forcing a small smile. As she sat down, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I thought it would be better to talk here, in a place that feels a little more neutral." Brian nodded, the tension evident in the way he held his body. He sat beside her, close enough for their shoulders to touch, but the space between them felt like an abyss. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I just want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Andrea's heart raced. His words were a balm, but the shadows of doubt still loomed large. "Brian, I've been thinking too. About us, about our future. And I'm scared, so scared." "Scared of what?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "Of losing myself," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've been trying so hard to fit into your world, to be the person you need, but it feels like I'm drowning. And I don't know if I can keep fighting against the current." Brian took a deep breath, his heart aching for her. "You don't have to fight, Andrea. You don't have to change who you are to fit in with my family. I love you for who you are, not for who they want you to be." "But your family," she began, but he interrupted gently. "They'll come around. They just need time to understand. I can't lose you, Andrea. You mean everything to me." His eyes locked onto hers, pleading for her to see the sincerity in his words. "But what if they never accept me?" she asked, the fear spilling out of her. "What if I'm always the outsider? I don't want to be the reason you're torn between your family and me. It's not fair to either of us." Brian took her hands in his grip firm yet tender. "You're not the outsider. You're the woman I love, and that should be enough. I'll fight for you, Andrea. I'll fight for us." Tears brimmed in Andrea's eyes as she felt the weight of his words sink in. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that love could conquer all, but the doubts still nagged at her heart. "What if I can't keep doing this, Brian? What if it becomes too much?" Brian's face softened, and he leaned closer, searching her eyes. "Then we'll figure it out together. I won't let you face it alone. We'll find a way." Andrea's breath hitched as she looked into his eyes, searching for the truth behind his words. "But what does that mean for our future? Can we really build a life together when there are so many obstacles?" "I want a future with you," he said firmly. "I can't imagine my life without you. But we need to be honest about what we want. I need to know if you're willing to fight for us." The weight of his question hung in the air, and Andrea felt the pressure of the moment. Could she really fight? Could she push through the pain of not belonging? A part of her wanted to run away, to escape the chaos of their situation, but another part, a stronger part, yearned to stand by Brian's side. "I want to fight," she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "I want to try, but I need you to promise me that we'll face whatever comes together. No more pretending, no more silence. We have to be open and honest with each other, no matter how hard it gets." Brian's face broke into a smile, relief washing over him. "I promise. No more hiding. We'll face this together, whatever it takes." As they sat beneath the oak tree, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, Andrea felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was still filled with uncertainties and challenges, but the strength of their love was worth fighting for. For the first time in days, she felt like they were on the same team again, united against the world. In that moment, with Brian's hand in hers, she took a deep breath, embracing the possibility of a future together, a future where they would navigate the storms hand in hand. But even as hope blossomed in her heart, she knew the journey wouldn't be simple. They were still standing on the precipice, the weight of their differences threatening to pull them apart. Yet for now, they were ready to fight. Days turned into weeks as Andrea and Brian navigated the delicate terrain of their relationship. They faced awkward family gatherings and uncomfortable social events together, learning to communicate openly about their feelings and frustrations. Each challenge brought them closer, forging a bond strengthened by their shared vulnerability. However, the struggle with Brian's family lingered in the background, like a storm cloud waiting to unleash its fury. They both knew it was only a matter of time before the storm would break. But for now, they clung to each other, drawing strength from the love that had always been their foundation. One evening, after a particularly challenging dinner with Brian's family, they returned to her apartment, exhausted yet determined. Andrea collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't think I can do that again," she said, her voice muffled by her fingers. Brian sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I know it's tough, but we're in this together, remember?" "Yeah, but every time I'm with them, I feel like I'm under a microscope," Andrea confessed, looking up at him with weary eyes. "I just want to be accepted, Brian. I want to feel like I belong." Brian sighed, his heart aching for her. "I hate that they make you feel this way. You deserve so much better." "I don't want to keep fighting for their approval, Brian. It's exhausting," she admitted, tears pooling in her eyes again. "Then we won't. We'll focus on what we have. What we're building together," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We can create our own family, our own life. I'm committed to you, Andrea." His words wrapped around her like a warm embrace, comforting and reassuring. "I want that too, Brian. I want to build a life with you." They sat in silence, the weight of their reality settling in once more. Andrea's mind raced with possibilities, dreams of a life filled with love, laughter, and acceptance. But she also knew the journey wouldn't be easy. They had a long way to go before they could truly find peace amidst the chaos. "Let's take it one day at a time," she suggested, determination sparking within her. "No more overwhelming ourselves with what-ifs. Just us moving forward." Brian smiled, his heart swelling with love and admiration for her strength. One day at a time sounds perfect. As they settled into a comfortable silence, Andrea felt a newfound sense of hope. They had faced the first wave of challenges together, and while the road ahead remained uncertain, she knew they were ready to confront whatever came their way, together. But as the days turned into months, the reality of their differences would test the strength of their love in ways they couldn't yet foresee. Would they emerge victorious, or would the pressure of societal expectations tear them apart? Only time would tell, but for now, they held on to each other, ready to embrace the future, whatever it may bring. The season began to shift as the leaves turned from vibrant greens to warm hues of orange and red. Autumn arrived in the city, and with it came a sense of change that felt both thrilling and daunting. Andrea stood by her apartment window, watching the wind dance through the trees, contemplating the journey she and Brian had taken to arrive at this moment. After months of navigating family gatherings and societal expectations, They had come to an understanding that filled their hearts with hope and love. Yet the pressures from Brian's family lingered, creating a tension that they both felt. Andrea had learned to lean on Brian, and together they crafted a life filled with laughter, late-night talks, and shared dreams of a future they yearned to build. As she turned away from the window, a small smile graced her lips. Today was a special day. They were celebrating their anniversary, marking 1 year since their fateful meeting. Brian had planned something wonderful, and the anticipation fluttered in her chest. When she arrived at the designated meeting place, a quaint cafe adorned with autumn leaves and fairy lights, she spotted Brian at a corner table, his eyes sparkling with excitement. He was beaming, radiating warmth that drew her in like a moth to a flame. "Happy anniversary!" he exclaimed as she approached, rising to embrace her. His arms wrapped around her in a comforting hug, and she breathed in his familiar scent, feeling the stresses of the world melt away. "Happy anniversary, Brian," she replied, her heart swelling. "I can't believe it's been a year." "Time flies when you're having fun," he said, pulling out her chair with a playful grin. "I have a surprise for you." Her eyes widened with curiosity as he produced a small, beautifully wrapped box from his bag. "You didn't have to get me anything," she said, her heart racing. "Open it," he urged, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. With trembling hands, Andrea unwrapped the gift, revealing a delicate silver necklace adorned with a heart-shaped pendant. "Oh, Brian, it's beautiful," she exclaimed, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you so much. I wanted to give you something that symbolizes our love," he explained. "Something that you can wear close to your heart." She clasped the necklace around her neck, the pendant resting just above her heart. "It's perfect," she whispered, feeling the warmth of his love wrap around her like a warm embrace. As they shared a lovely meal, laughter filled the air, mingling with the sweet aroma of freshly baked pastries. They reminisced about their journey, recounting the ups and downs, the challenges they had faced, and how far they had come. Each shared memory strengthened their bond, reinforcing the love that had grown between them. "I still can't believe your family didn't completely lose it at the last gathering," Andrea laughed, recalling the awkward but ultimately warm reception they had received. "I thought I'd faint when they started asking me about my career choices." Brian chuckled, his eyes dancing with mischief. "I was just as terrified, but you handled it like a pro. You charmed them." Andrea's heart swelled with pride. "I wouldn't have been able to do it without you by my side." "I'd fight for you, Andrea," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "No matter what, you're worth it." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the cafe, they decided to take a stroll through the nearby park. The atmosphere felt magical, with the vibrant colors of autumn leaves swirling around them as they walked hand in hand. "Look at the leaves," Andrea remarked, watching as a gust of wind sent a flurry of orange and yellow spiraling around them. "It's like nature is celebrating with us." "It really is," Brian said, pulling her closer. "Every moment with you feels like a celebration." As they reached a secluded spot beneath a sprawling oak tree, Brian paused, turning to face Andrea. His expression grew serious, and she felt her heart race with anticipation. "Andrea," he began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "You know how much I love you, right?" "Of course," she replied, her eyes searching his. "I can't imagine my life without you," he continued, taking a deep breath. "I've thought about our future a lot lately, and I want to spend it with you. I want us to build a life together, one filled with love, laughter, and everything we dream of." Andrea's heart raced as she realized where this was headed. "Brian, I know we've faced challenges, and there are still hurdles ahead, but I believe in us," he said, his voice unwavering. "I want you to be my partner in this life, through the good times and the bad. Will you marry me?" He pulled out a small velvet box, and with a trembling hand, he opened it to reveal a stunning ring that sparkled in the fading light. Andrea's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding with disbelief and joy. "Brian, I don't know what to say," she stammered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Say yes," he urged, his eyes filled with hope and love. "Say yes to a future together, to a life filled with all the love we can give each other." Overwhelmed with emotion, Andrea nodded, unable to contain her joy. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you," she exclaimed, laughter mingling with her tears. Brian slipped the ring onto her finger, and they both marveled at the beauty of the moment. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them beneath the oak tree, their love blossoming like the vibrant colors of autumn. "I can't believe this is happening," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It feels like a dream." "It's real," he assured her, pulling her into a warm embrace. "You and me forever." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the golden light of the setting sun bathed them in warmth. In that moment, all the challenges they had faced felt worth it. Their love had triumphed over doubt, fear, and societal expectations. They had chosen each other time and again, and that choice had led them to this beautiful moment. In the weeks that followed, Andrea and Brian threw themselves into planning their wedding. Excitement filled the air as they navigated the details of their special day, deciding on a venue, choosing colors, and creating a guest list. It was a whirlwind of love and laughter, and every moment felt like a celebration of their journey together. Brian's family, slowly but surely, began to come around. They witnessed the depth of love between Andrea and Brian, and their hearts began to soften. Conversations that once felt strained turned into opportunities for connection, and Andrea found herself forging bonds with Brian's relatives that she had once thought impossible. The wedding day finally arrived, a sun-drenched afternoon in early spring. Andrea stood in front of the mirror, her heart racing with excitement. She wore a beautiful gown that flowed like water, the intricate lace shimmering as she moved. Her hair cascaded in soft waves, and the necklace Brian had gifted her rested against her chest, a symbol of their love that as she made her way to the venue, she couldn't shake the nervous excitement bubbling within her. She could hardly believe she was about to marry the love of her life. The garden was adorned with vibrant flowers, and soft music floated through the air, creating an atmosphere that felt like a fairy tale. When the moment came for her to walk down the aisle, she locked eyes with Brian, who stood at the altar, his gaze filled with adoration. He looked dapper in his tailored suit, and the smile on his face lit up the entire garden. As she walked towards him, time seemed to stand still. Each step felt monumental, a step closer to forever. The moment their hands joined was electrifying, and all the doubts and fears melted away, leaving only love in its purest form. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with heartfelt vows and promises that echoed through the air. When Brian spoke about their journey, his voice trembled with emotion, and Andrea felt tears of joy spill down her cheeks. She had never felt so loved, so cherished as she did in that moment. "I promise to stand by you through every storm," Brian vowed, his voice steady and sincere. "To celebrate with you in times of joy and to comfort you in times of sorrow. I will love you fiercely, always." When it was her turn, Andrea spoke from her heart, her words flowing like a river. "You've taught me the true meaning of love. You've shown me that I am worthy of happiness and belonging. I promise to stand with you, to love you unconditionally, and to face whatever challenges life throws our way, hand in hand." When they exchanged rings, the world faded into the background, leaving only the two of them enveloped in love. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and they shared a passionate kiss, sealing their promises with the sweetest union. As they celebrated with friends and family, the atmosphere buzzed with joy and laughter. They danced under twinkling lights, surrounded by love and acceptance, feeling like the world was theirs to conquer. Andrea looked around at the faces beaming with happiness and realized that she had finally found her place, not just in Brian's heart, but in his family's as well. Later that evening, they stood on a balcony, overlooking the twinkling lights of the city. "Can you believe we did it?" Brian asked, wrapping his arms around Andrea. "I can't," she replied, a contented smile on her face. "It feels like a dream." "It's our dream," he said softly. "And it's just the beginning." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Andrea felt a sense of peace wash over her. They had overcome so much together, and now they were ready to embrace whatever the future held. In Brian, she had found a partner, a best friend, and a love that would endure through all the challenges life might throw their way. In the heart of the city, beneath the stars, Andrea and Brian stood together, two souls intertwined, ready to embark on a beautiful journey towards happily ever after. They knew that life would not always be easy, but they had each other, and together they could face anything. With a heart full of dreams and love, Andrea whispered, "Here's to our forever." And Brian, his gaze fixed on the horizon, replied, "Forever, my love." They both understood that this was just the beginning of a beautiful adventure, a life filled with love, laughter, and an unbreakable bond that would weather every storm. Together, they would write their story, page by page, until the end of time. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.